Okay, so continuing with step sequencer, let's look at all these values now. I'm going to show you how they work with examples. So the default for the step sequencer is step on off, and we use that to input steps. So the step sounds a note or a drum, and take them out. We then switch to the value list and we choose a value, the default of which is velocity, and we can then adjust the selected value for all steps on all rows. Right. We can adjust steps on any row individually, but on a lane we can adjust steps independently. And bear in mind, you can adjust steps for any value whether or not that step has an on command on it. Right. So if I adjust the velocity for these 3 steps and then make those 3 steps on, they'll pick up any values that are on those steps before they were switched on to sound a note, or in the case of drums, a drum. Right. But for the individual lane, we can use the arrows here to adjust the values altogether for the row, and you click and drag up and down, and you're dragging all the values. They keep their relative levels relative to each other for the value. But if you keep holding and push all the way up, when the step with the highest value that you're editing gets to its highest level, you can still keep pushing all the other steps up until they're all at maximum value. And as long as you don't let go, you can then drag back down, and the individual steps remember their value relative to each other, and those get picked up. And then if you drag all the way down, when the lowest step gets to its lowest possible value for the value you're editing, you can still keep dragging down until all steps are at the lowest possible value. And as long as you don't let go and then push back up, they'll all pick up and resume and remember their original values relative to each other. Okay. And you alt left click on the arrows to reset the value you're editing for all steps in the row. Okay, now before we go on, bear something in mind. I think I showed this in the first video, but you can open up the row to reveal the sublanes for the row, and the sublanes are the values. Initially, when you do that, you'll get a certain amount of these values. They will be different for pitched instruments patterns than for drums, but you can use the plus to add additional sublanes until you have a sublane for every one of the possible values if you want to. And then if you do it like that, if you keep this then in step on off, the original main row becomes always the row for switching a step on or off. Right? And the sublanes are then used to adjust whatever they're assigned to: velocity, start offset, note repeat, gate, etc. for the step. And again, for the individual sublane, you can use the arrows to adjust all steps on the row for that value for the lane. And they again remember their values relative to each other. Those same rules that I showed you on the main row apply. And you can alt left click to reset, 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 reset. But bear something else in mind. If the row is compacted, and let's say I've got velocity on these steps like that, if I kick the row, I'm kicking all values on the steps in whatever direction I'm kicking them. But if the lanes are opened out, so you see sublanes for the individual values, I can kick the velocity independently of the step-ons and any other values. I'm just kicking the velocity values only now. All the other values remain where they are. Or I can, look, I'm just kicking the start offsets in either direction. All other values remain where they are. The note repeats. I'm kicking all the note repeats in either direction. All other values remain where they are. And the same with gate. I can make all these have a different gate and kick the row for the gates in either direction, and they're moving independently of all other values. Okay, so you can do that. Let's reset these. I'll click to reset, 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 reset. Okay, so you add additional lanes with a plus, add a new lane, assign it to whatever other value you want. It can be any value that doesn't already have a sublane, and take away lanes with the X, right? Okay. All right, so let's go through the values. Well, I mean, velocity is pretty straightforward, right? You just switch to velocity and you're adjusting velocity for all steps in the pattern, whether they are in an on state or not. And I already showed you, if you adjust the velocity or any other value, or any other value on steps and then switch them on, so they're generating a note, the values of the previously unswitched on steps are assigned to the notes being generated once you switch those steps on. Okay. Now, velocity is just, adjusting the velocity, right? All up and down relative to each other, push all the way up, they all go to maximum. Don't let go and drag back down, they all pick up their relative values, drag to the bottom, they all go to minimum. Don't let go and push back up, they all remember their values, and now I'm adjusting them relative to each other again. Alt left click to reset. So velocity is pretty straightforward, it's just to adjust the velocity of a step, be it a pitch, step, or a drum, right? Alt left click to reset. Now, gate and tie, these are often used together. So that's probably why they're next door to each other like this, with velocity, which is another primary thing that you're going to want to edit, whether you're editing drums or a pitched pattern. Gate and tie work together. Now, usually you'll use these when you're sequencing pitched instrument patterns, but if you look in the description below, there's a link to the playlist for all my step sequencer videos, and in the last video I'm going to show you some really cool tricks you can do with gate and tie in the step sequencer with Drum Machine Designer to do some very interesting things with drums. All right, with the Drum Machine Designer. Okay, but primarily these are going to be used for pitched instruments. So let me show you that. Over here I've got a reggae drum pattern. There it is. There's the step-ons and what have you. Okay, I've got 16ths for the hats, but if you look at the velocity, every other hat is much lower in velocity to give it a feel. So really straightforward, buff, baff, simplest reggae beat you can have. Now, the bass line with that, this is done, a pitched pattern, using primarily gate and tie. After that, you can obviously use velocity to adjust the velocity of different steps, notes, and we can also use start offset, which we'll come to. But let me just go with gate and tie now. So look, here's my bass line. Now I put a pattern on the bass track, and I loaded up a 2-octave chromatic map template. It's given me 2 chromatic octaves. Yes, C1 to C3. That's all black and white notes, right? And what I did was, let's use the functions that we learned in menus. We're going to, for all rows, clear tie, and for all rows we're going to remove a clear gate, and for all rows will clear velocity as well. So the only thing on now active in this pattern is step-ons. And so what I did was I started by putting a step on at the pitch I wanted for the bass line in the positions I needed those steps to be in terms of timing for the bass pattern. Okay, then I said about making the notes the length I want, and for that I use tie, because with tie you can tie steps together. Now, when you activate a step in the default value of 16ths, so that it's sounding a note, the note is always the length of the step, and these are 16th steps, so the note in this step is a 16th in length. But I can tie this step and this step together, and now I have an 8th note. If you look at this, the region here, okay, there it is, right? That's the original 16th step note. It's a 16th in length there, right? Right, these are the 16ths, these vertical ladders divided by vertical lines. Right, there's the original note, a 16th in length. Tie it together with the next step, and now it's these two steps over an 8th timing value are going to play an 8th length note over the length of those two 16th steps tied together. I tie another step in, and now my note here is 3/16 in length and lasts over the timing of those 3/16 steps. So I get a longer note. So I did the same thing to these, to that note, and the same to that note, and that then gives me my longer notes of the pattern. Like that. All right. Now, bear something in mind. Let me tie this next step in on that note. Okay, now this note, there it is, there, spans all 4/16, so it's a quarter beat in length note. When you untie steps that are tied together, you don't sort of go like that and think, right, I've untied. No, you haven't. You've just simply untied that step from these three. They're still tied together. Right? To untie steps, you've got to untie them a node at a time, working backwards. Untie, untie, untie. Right, and now those steps are all untied. So let me tie them back together. Okay, so I've made this note, and this note longer, 3/16 in length. But then I think to myself, well, actually, I want this note to be a little bit longer than 3/16, but I don't want it to be 4/16, a whole quarter beat in length. All you do is you just tie in another step. Now this note, look, is a quarter beat in length over the 4/16. But I now go to gate, and gate allows you to adjust how long the note on a step or tied together steps lasts. Right? Yeah. And so that I can bring the gate back, and now this note is going to last 1, 2, 3 and a little bit 16ths. Just over 1, 2, 3 16ths. Because it's stopping here. It's stopping there, this much into that fourth tied 16th step. You look at the note there, 1, 2, 3, and a little bit extra 16ths in length. You can do this on any length step. Like there's a step. Always when you activate a step to be on, the note being generated is the length of the step. There it is, a 16th in length. But I can use gate to reduce it. At 50%, this 16th note at 50% is now exactly a 32nd, exactly half the length of a 16th step. And you can bring it all the way down to like 5% until it's the most tiny, look, if we just zoom, right, and you can just see it there. The most tiny short little note, it's probably a 192nd value note or something. Okay. But the step is still a 16th in length, right? So that's what I've done here. I just tied together 4 16th steps to make a quarter beat in length note, and then went to gate and backed off the length of those 4 steps tied together. So my note is now just over 3/16 in length. Right? Well, we don't need that note, sorry. And you can see the note now ends here. A little bit more than the 3/16. So yeah, because I just wanted that extra little bit of feel. I didn't want it dropping off here. I wanted it dropping off just after that. So I do the same thing to this. This is 4/16 now. Gate. Back it off a bit, and this note also is just over 3/16 in length now. So they're being held a little bit more than 3/16, those two notes. This one I'll leave as it is. And then I thought, well, I don't want this note to spill into that note, and I don't want that note to spill into that. So with gate still selected, I shorten the length of this note, so it's not playing the full 16th step in length, and it's going to end and leave a little gap before that note sounds. The same with that, and I'll make this a bit staccato as well, like that. So these are a little bit more staccato. Each of these three notes now are less than the 16th step in length. And this note, I'll make it just a little bit shorter than 3/16, so it just ends a little bit before the 3/16 of its length. And that way you can achieve exactly the length of notes that you want. Alright. And then of course you can use velocity to set the velocity for the notes that you want. Like I might make this one slightly less in velocity, these two like that, or something like that, yeah. Alright. And then if I wanted to adjust the timing of where the notes start, we use start offset. Right, which actually we'll look at here. So start offset, this is another one that you'll use a lot when you're making patterns, but also we'll look at this in a minute with drums. So look, if I put a step on that step, there it is, look, you see it there it is, the 16th length note filling the entire width of that step. Come on, let's see a bit more. Right, there it is, there. Now if I use start offset, I can offset the start of the note. In fact, what I'm going to do is, let's put it not on that step, but let's put it on this step. Now start offset, there's the note there on the 3/16, filling the 3/16. I can use start offset to make my note start a little bit later, and the vertical line is the start of this note. But the note is still going to be a 16th in length because it's a step on for this 16th. So it'll always be a 16th in length, unless I change that with gate to make it shorter than a 16th, right? But with start offset, I can now adjust where the note starts. I can bring it back in time, so it's starting later and later and later from the start of the step. But it's still going to be a 16th in length. So the maximum for this is 50%. Now the 16th note being generated on that step begins exactly in the middle of the step, a 32nd into that 16th step. And you can see there's the note now pushed back that way, exactly half the width of the step. But it's still a 16th in length note, so it's going to end in the middle of the next step, which it does there. And if I push this the other way, minus 50%, the maximum, the note now we see going this way, we see where the note ends. But it's a note on a 16th step, so it's always going to be a 16th in length. But this vertical line is now where the note ends. So if we bring this down to minus 50%, the maximum in that direction, the note ends exactly in the middle of this 16th step. But it's still a 16th in length, so it's been pushed this way by exactly half a 16th, a 32nd. So it's going to begin exactly in the middle of the previous step there, right? So push that way or that way. And essentially, obviously, you use this to offset the timing of notes to make them slightly later or push them slightly ahead of the beat, whatever you want, right? Now you can use that in pitch patterns, obviously. I'll get rid of that. You can use them in pitch patterns to, you know, offset the start or make a note in a pattern slightly early. So I might go, well, look, this note, I'm going to just have it play a little bit late, just a little, to give it a little bit of feel slightly behind the beat. And this one, and this one, they'll be a little bit late, and this one just a smidge late, and then this one just a smidge late, but I'm leaving the opening note right on the money. That's just going to introduce a feel that all these bass notes, they're going to be all slightly behind the drums, a little bit sort of lazy in their feel. That's a little bit too much, maybe, like that. And that just pushes them back and gives them that little bit of, you know, the bassist is just dropping those notes just slightly behind the drum beat to give it that slightly late feel, right? You can do all that with start offset. Now, we'll also use start offset a lot with drums. So where is it? Let's go back to that drum pattern. This crate digger drum pattern there. I think that's the one I want. Yeah. Okay. Put a cycle range around that. Okay. So this, let's take these out. Okay. Is a basic beat. Right. Let's see if there is any start offset on here. There is some already, so let me clear that. For all row values, clear start offset. Right, and also for all row values, clear the step rate. Okay, now with start offset turned off for all steps, every step is going to be right on the money, right on its timing. It's a little bit sort of robotic, so with start offset I can push my snares back so they're late with the claps. Actually, I'm going to drop the claps a smidge back so they're just slightly late. Give them a slightly late feel, but the snares on the same beat, I'm going to push them back later than the claps. Which starts to introduce almost a flam between them, a little bit looser, and then I'll push that kick a smidge back, just a smidge, and that one as well. And then I'm going to get the entire hi-hat row, and using the arrows where you're adjusting all values on the row, I can push every hi-hat step back as much or as little as I want. So I'm going to push the whole hi-hat row back in time, the start of each of those steps, by 4%. It's only a little, but it's just going to make the hi-hat slightly lazy behind the beat. But the very first one here, I'm going to alt reset so it's right on the money, and then this one at the start of the second half of the bar, right on the money. Now I'll just push the hats back a bit. And straight away the pattern is starting to lose that robotic, right on the money metronomic feel it had, right? Okay, you use it in drums or pitched instruments to introduce feel, right? Basically behind, just to make notes behind the beat or make them snatch slightly in front of the beat, you know, whatever you want. Start offset. Now I know it's further down the list than gate and tie, but I've jumped to it because it's velocity, gate, tie and start offset are 4 values that you're going to use a lot when you're building pitched instrument patterns. Velocity and start offset you will use for drums, But as I said, in the final video of this playlist, and the link for the playlist is in the description, I'm going to show you a technique where you can use gate and tie together with the step sequencer and drum machine designer, and then we do a trick sort of thing with drum machine designer where we can then use gate and tie to do some really cool stuff with drums. Alright, okay, we'll come to that in the final video. Okay, so that's velocity, gate, tie and start offset. Let's look at note and octave now, because they're kind of next door to each other for a good reason. So note and octave. Now again, this is pretty much always going to be used when you're doing pitched instrument patterns. However, if you put a step sequencer pattern on an individual drum machine designer lane, like not the main track group bus lane, but an individual lane for a drum, you'll then be sequencing that individual drum's quick sampler directly, and the sample can be played over all 10 octaves of the keyboard. So then you can get into using note and octave to play tuned drum patterns, melodic drum patterns, but generally speaking we use note and octave for pitched instruments. So let's quickly look at that. Right, Yamaha grand piano, and I'll put an empty pan here at the playhead, boom, like that, put a cycle range around it. As usual, I get the default 4-bar long pattern region block, and by default, as usual, my default pattern is 16 steps long at the default value of a 16th for each step, 1 bar in length. And with a pitched instrument I get this starting 1 octave major scale map C2 to C3. Right now, as we already looked at with the templates, I will load a template for the particular scale I want before I begin sequencing. Okay. So I'll load up major, even though this is a 1 octave default major scale. If I load up major, where is it? I now get 2 octaves in the major scale, C2 to C4, because it always wants to put C3 in the middle. All these templates, apart from the chromatic 3 octave, load up 2 octaves, and C3 will always be in the middle, unless you've changed the pattern key. Right, all right. Okay, so here we go. Now, if I put a note in the middle there at C3, and a note at the top on C4, and a note at the bottom on C2, they're all on C, on the 3 different octaves, the bottom, the middle and the top. Then I switch to note. Now when you switch to note, let's zoom right in, the step becomes a ladder, and the ladder is always 2 octaves. It can't be any more than 2 octaves, because this 2 octave ladder has to represent all the semitones across 2 octaves. If it had to represent all the semitones across the entire keyboard, C minus 2 to C8, all 10 octaves, this vertical ladder would need to be more than the height of the entire screen for you to be able to get an easy to distinguish horizontal line between each semitone. So when you switch to note, the step is made into a 2 octave ladder. Now this is C4 at the top of the 2 octaves I'm working in, because remember I'm working in 2 octaves, C2 to C4 with C3 in the middle. So the top ladder on C4, the ladder is right at the top of this 2 octaves on C4, and as soon as I move that, it changes colour and this switches to say melodic. But that is where this note is, C4, at the very top of this 2 octave ladder. The middle C, its line is in obviously the middle of the 2 octave ladder at C3, and the bottom C at C2, its line is right at the bottom of this 2 octave ladder at C2, right? And so therefore you can change a note on a step to be any pitch you want within the octave range of the template you're working in. Right, you load up the template, and if you need to set it outside of C2 to C4 with C3 in the middle, you change the key here. Right. Okay. So therefore, you can take any note and adjust its pitch. Right. If I wanted to make this note, because with this major scale I'm getting white notes only, but there I can make it C#3. Now, as soon as you do go into note and adjust a note to have a different step to its default for the row, this switches to say melodic. Alright, so let's look at octave and note together now in melodic, because look, this note down here, we're in the pattern key of C. We haven't transposed, so this major map is C2 to C4, right? C3 in the middle. That bottom step there, as I showed you already, its ladder value when I switch to note is right at the bottom of the 2-octave ladder. This 2-octave ladder is the same as for what I'm working in. It's C2 at the bottom, C3 right in the middle, and C4 at the top. So that's at C2, as low as it can go. Or what if I wanted to make this note 1 semitone lower to B1? Well, I have to go to octave, and my octave is in the middle because I've not transposed this up or down away from C2 to C4 with the C3 in the middle. Lower this step an octave, go back to note, and now because this step has been lowered an octave, it goes from C1, C2 in the middle, C3 at the top. So to make this step B1, I put the note in the middle, C2, which was at the bottom of the ladder when it was not transposed down an octave, and lower it down one more step. Now it's on B1, right? So that's how that works. Now this melodic thing, to show you that, I'm going to use function, clear all rows of octave, clear all rows of note, and clear all rows of step on off. Okay, and then I'll just select this row, and I can. There is a command to delete row, but I can also, as long as it's empty, I can select the row and backspace, 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 back, and I've got just one row now. Okay, now this row might not be in melodic, it might be assigned to a pitch, but I can put it into melodic. Now it's in melodic. I'm in the pattern key of C. Alright. I put a step on that 16th. Go to note. It's in the middle at C3. The middle. That's the value of that line. C3. At the bottom is C2. At the top is C4. Right? Now, if that's the octave I want to work in, fine. Yes, I can go to octave and lower with the pair of arrows the octave for all steps, down, 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 as far down or as far up as I want to go. But it's probably, but you can do the same thing. This is now back to the default, C3 in the middle, C2 at the bottom, C4 at the top. But I can go here to transpose down an octave. Right, and now because this is C, it's gone down an octave. C2 is at the bottom. C3 is still in the middle. C4 is still at the top because all it did is it transposed the note on this step. It didn't transpose the octave of the steps. Okay, all we did is when you do transpose, you're transposing the value of notes on steps. So transposing isn't going to transpose all these steps down. So I can work in an octave lower than the default I've got, C2 to C4. That won't work. I've got to go to octave and lower the octave of all steps. Right? Back to note. Now all these steps are C1 C2 in the middle, up to C3 at the top. Right? You getting that? Okay, so and now I can build a pattern. Put in some steps. Go back to note. I've already gone to octave and changed these to be an octave lower than the default, so I'm in a lower octave. Back to note. Now I can build my melody. Simple major scale, right? Yeah. Now if I want to lower this down an octave, but so that the ladders can have still some workable range, if I transpose, yeah, it'll transpose it down an octave, but these rows are still going to be the same as in the same octave as usual. I can go to octave here. Now this, ready, watch. Down an octave. Back to note. Now these ladders may not look the same now. Right, now we've gone down an octave. Sometimes you'll do it and you might find it looks a bit different to this, but no, we've just lowered them all down an octave. Right? Yeah. So you can do all that stuff. You can build melodic patterns and set steps into any octave and then to any note that you want. Okay, now I could go to tie and tie that note and that note together so they're eighths. And now I get this. Now I could go to gate and make these shorter little stabby notes if I want, like that. But leave that last one 16th like that. If I want to, I can now go to octave and change the octave of any note. I could make it like that. Yeah, whatever I want. And of course I can then go to velocity and adjust the velocity of steps. And I can then go to start offset and slightly offset the start time of some of the notes to make them later or earlier, whatever I want, etc. Right, okay. That's note and octave. Ready? Okay. Okay, so we've done velocity gate, tie, note, octave. We've done start offset. Let's look at loop next. Now loop, you're probably going to end up using it mostly for drums. And loop allows us to do some good time-saving stuff. So here's that pattern again. Right, simple. Right, there's my hi-hat, and this is a 1-bar pattern. Now remember that thing at the very, very start, in the very first video in this series I showed you, where we do a great time saver. We can put together a simple pattern over the default 1-bar 16-step length pattern with the step value at the default 16ths. We get a 1-bar starting pattern. We put together a simple beat, and in the default 4-bar long region block, that is translated as the 1-bar pattern we've built, which is repeated 3 times over the next 3 bars to give us a 4-bar long pattern that repeats over and over. But the pattern is just this 1 bar repeating in bar 2, 3 and 4. If I put an extra step in this 1-bar pattern, it's repeated in all the following 3 bars, because whatever I do in this 1 bar is repeated in bar 2, 3 and 4 of this region, right? But the time saver is that once we've made that simple 1-bar pattern, we just then extend our pattern out to 4 bars long, 64 steps, and that simple 1-bar pattern is hard baked into the next 3 bars to make a 4-bar pattern, after which we can then put in our variations on the kick over the 4 bars. But we don't have to go through the hassle of stepping in the same pattern 4 times. Just make it once, make the pattern 4 times as long, that hard bakes that pattern into all 4 bars, then we add our variations across the new 4-bar long pattern. But now let's say I wanted to adjust the hi-hats. Oh my god, they're repeated now, also hard baked into the whole 4 bars. So if I want to adjust this pattern, I've got to do it in this bar, and then go to the next bar and adjust it in the next bar, and then the next, and then the next. Well, what you do is, go back to 16 steps, you turn on loop. Now loop allows us to make any row any length we want. So I can make my hi-hat, because you can adjust the start as well, I can make my hi-hat just this quarter beat, just those 4/16. And when I hit play, this quarter beat for 4 steps of the hi-hat, 3 of them on, 1 of them off, is just going to repeat round and round 4 times while the rest of the pattern plays over all 16 steps. Right. So if I make my basic 1 bar pattern, switch on loop, and then make my hi-hat, which is it's 1 bar like the rest of the pattern, but I just make its loop 1 step shorter. Then I make my pattern 4 bars long. That hard bakes the pattern in the 1 bar into the next 3 bars, but not the hi-hat, because it had a loop which was less than the length of the 1 bar that was then made 4 bars, so that 1 bar was hard baked into all 4 bars of the new 4 bar long pattern, which means now it remembers the step I backed off. Just bring this loop out so the hi-hat covers the whole of the first bar, and now the hi-hat here will loop round its 1 bar pattern while the rest of the pattern plays the whole 4 bars. I can then put in my variations for, I can then put in my variations for things like the kick across my new 4 bars. And if I decide I want to edit the hi-hat pattern, I've only got to do it over this 1 bar, because it's going to cycle round that 1 bar 4 times while the rest of the pattern plays the full 4 bars like this. Right? So if I need to change the hi-hat pattern, I don't have to edit it across this bar, and then across that bar, and then across that bar, and then across that bar. I just use this zoom in thing, boom, boom, twice, which puts my 4 bar pattern into, now I see it as bar 1, 2, 3 and 4 of the whole 4 bars. I go to the first bar where the hi-hat is, and I adjust whatever it is I want to adjust with my hi-hat pattern. Right, let me just slightly change the hi-hat pattern. I mean, that's a bit mad, but let's say that's what I want. Well, I only had to do it in this 1 bar. Now I zoom out till I see the whole 64 steps, and now that pattern is edited. It'll play over all 4 bars. I haven't got to do that complex edit on all 4 bars of the hi-hat. It's going to cycle around its 1 bar while the rest of the pattern plays the full 4 bars in length with any of those variations in that I've added. Okay, so it's a great time saver for drum pans. You can have 1 drum part cycling around a shorter little loop, and it'll just play along the length of the pattern along with everything else, and then you just can tweak that 1 little sub pattern, let's call it, and it'll just keep repeating around the length of the pattern, whatever it is, 1 bar, 2 bars, 4 bars, whatever. And you only have to edit that 1 instance of it, and it'll just keep repeating along with the rest of the pattern, which can have variations across its length, right? Well, we can use loop for pitched instruments. There may be some other wacky ideas I could come up with for using it, but the sort of most obvious one that, why is studio cellos in there? Get away. The most obvious one that springs to mind is to put in a repeating motif while the rest of the pattern does something else. So let's put a pattern region on this piano, and I get the default 1 bar major thing like that, and what I'm going to do is make the bottom row melodic. Alright, I think you can probably guess what I'm going to actually know. You know what I'm going to do before that? I'm going to make this, I'm going to load up the major template, give me 2 octaves. C2 to C4 with C3 in the middle. But I'm going to make that bottom row melodic. Melodic. Let's zoom right into that row. There it is, at the bottom. Now I'm going to use loop. Remember, we're in the default 1 bar long pattern, right? I'm going to use loop and make this just half a bar. Okay, then put in 4 notes like that. I'm now going to go to octave and lower all rows in the step down 2 octaves. Now I get, slow the tempo down like that. Now back to note, and we're using note and octave here, but it's about what we're doing with this loop. This loop is shorter than the rest of the 1 bar pattern. Now obviously there's my simple motif of the bass part which is going to cycle around that half a bar. Now let's say I make my pattern twice the length, 32 steps. Okay, now my pattern is 2 bars long. 2 bars long, right? But the bass motif, this lick, is going to cycle around that half a bar, the next half a bar, and then over the last bar it'll cycle around twice as well. So this will keep playing 4 times because it's half a bar, while the rest of the pattern plays its full length, 2 bars. And then I just put in my melody over that, right? Obviously whoop. I'm not very good at melodic stuff. I'm not good at music theory. Something like that. And this motif is just going to play around because it's looped. It'll play around that half bar while the rest of the pattern plays over its 2 bars. Like that. Whoops. Like that. Yeah, you get the idea. I mean, that's just a very sort of crass example, but think about the things you could do. You can have a looping motif. It doesn't have to be in the bass end, which loops round just maybe 1 beat or half a bar. The rest of your pattern can have its variations in, and you can have multiple loops working. Any lane can have a loop. You could set up multiple melodic loops working to play 2 parts of a looping motif while the rest of the pattern plays something else. It just means you can do it all in one pattern instead of having the same instrument on 3 different tracks. One with the bass motif loop, one with the, let's say, a harmony or something motif loop, and then another track with the same instrument on doing the main melody. You can do the whole thing in one pattern on one instance of the instrument on a track. Okay, so that's different ways to use loop, start, end. Note repeat. Well, this is, you can use it on melodic patterns, I suppose, but you're going to mostly use it on drum patterns, right? Let's put this back to 1 bar, 16 steps. You're going to use it mostly in drum patterns to do those drilly note repeats on hi-hats, and it goes really extreme, right? In this, remember, this step sequencer was brought over from GarageBand iOS, where it's called Beat Sequencer, and it's used in GarageBand iOS only to sequence drums. But I'll tell you what, man, the first time I ever used it, I was like, and you can watch my GarageBand for iOS videos, and I'm always saying, why isn't this feature, why isn't this Beat Sequencer in GarageBand? In Logic, it's so superior to what we have in Logic for doing drums. Well, thank God they've added it, but you have the note repeat in the in the Beat Sequencer in GarageBand iOS, which is partly what makes it so good for doing drums, particularly in those styles that use this note repeat thing, you know, trap and grime and hip hop, etc., etc. In GarageBand iOS, the maximum repeats on a step are 8, but with this, now it's in Logic, we can have up to 16 repeats on a step. So on a 16th default value step, if my maths are right, 16 times 16, that means that each of these note repeats are like a 192nd or something. Anyway, you get the most extreme zipper type, you know, all that stuff. You can go really extreme with it. You know, anything you want, or just simple doubles to do a gallop or something. I suppose, thinking about it, if you were doing some sort of, I don't know, if you were making a rock drum pattern, you wanted to do, you know, or a bass, wanted to do an Iron Maiden gallop, you could use this. But the trouble is, if you put a note repeat and divided a 16th step note in half on a bass pattern, the two split in half note repeats would just smear into each other. There'd be no gap between them. So it wouldn't really work, but you'd have to go to a different resolution. But you know, that's where you're mostly going to use note repeat. Yeah, you can try using it in pitch patterns if you want. Right, it's note repeat. Let me just Alt left click on the note repeat for all the steps in the row there to reset them all to nothing. Right, next, chance. We've already looked at start offset. Chance, well, it's the percentage chance from 100% down to 1% of a note triggering on a step when the pattern is repeating around in the region container, which has been dragged out to be at least one copy more than the length of the pattern. So this is a 1-bar pattern. Right, this chance isn't going to work if the pattern's just cycling around once. If it's cycling around over 4 bars, then it starts to work. I set the percentage chance of a drum to trigger. Now look, let me show you this, because I'll tell you what, mate, this drove me absolutely insane. I spent ages fiddling with the chance, and sort of saying and trying to listen to, like, what the hell is the rule? You know, I put the chance at 50% and I'm listening and I can't figure out what the rule is. How many times it's not like GarageBand iOS. This feature in GarageBand iOS for drums does work when the pattern just cycles round and round and round 1 bar using its own internal sequencer, right? But not in Logic. It's dependent on copies of the original pattern repeating more than once in the region container block, which is dragged out to play that pattern multiple times, to loop it round. And it seems to be dependent on the length of the region, how many times that pattern is going to loop round and round in the region, right? So look, 5, 6, 7, that's now 8 bars long. So it's this simple 1-bar pattern repeating 8 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Now if I set this snare at 50%, this was driving me mad. I couldn't figure it out, but all the time I was listening and setting the percentage and listening and not being able to work out the rule. I had my Zoom kind of like that. And I didn't notice that if you zoom right in on the region itself, you can actually see. There's the first bar there, from there to there. That's this 1 bar pattern. The next 7 bars are the same pattern, repeating. But as you adjust the percentage chance, if you zoomed in on the region big enough, you can see where that snare will trigger, in which bars it will trigger, and in which bars it won't trigger based on a 50% chance at 8 bars of repeat. And actually at 50%, you need to set this after you've dragged the region out to its length. So let's reset that to 100%. This is now dragged out to 8 bars. Now set this to 50% chance. It's got a 50% chance of firing off when the pattern loops round. There you go, 50%. And we can look and we can see that over 8 bars, 8 repeats of this 1 bar pattern, at a 50% chance, that snare is going to play in bar 1, not in bar 2, then it's going to play in bar 3, not in bar 4, then it'll play in bar 5, not in bar 6, then in bar 7, and then not in bar 8. In this case, it seems to be at 50%. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. It will and won't play alternatively in each repeating bar. Let's make it, I don't know, 70%. Now it won't play in bar 1 or 2, but it's playing in bar 3, 4, not 5, but in 6, 7 and 8. Now it's strange how it works, right? Why isn't it playing in bar 1 and 2 at 70%? Why aren't, and then not again in bar 5? It's really strange. It's like impossible to work the rule out. But all you need to know is you set a note to trigger at a percentage chance, and you can look on the region and see for yourself. Now let's set this back to 100%, so it'll always trigger. Then we'll make this double the length. 2, 4, 6, 8. Now the region is 16 bars long. So this 1 bar pattern is going to loop around 16 times, and you should see a different effect here now, right? Let me fit this to the width. Shift Control Z. Right. Now that's the snare, the second row along there, those, right? So let's set it to 50%. And remember, we now have a loop, a region that is looping the pattern around 16 times. And at 50%, this snare is going to play in bar 1, 2, 3, but not 4. In 5, 6, but not 7. In 8, 9, 10, 11, but not 12. Not 13. Then it'll play in bar 14. Not in bar 15. And then in bar 16. So if you remember when this region was 8 bars long, at 50%, it played not in the first pattern, yes in the second, not in the third, yes in the fourth, not in the fifth, yes in the 6th bar, not in the 7th bar, yes in the 8th, like alternating. But now our pattern is 16 bars of repeat. It's repeating 16 times. 50%, we get a completely different sequence, so to speak. It's not just on, off, on, off. It's on, off. And I'm talking bars, like when I go on, off, like that's for each bar. On, off. On, off. On, off, off, on, off, on. So, like, I don't know what the rule is. I genuinely don't. But it's a 75%. Now, sometimes 75% on a shorter loop, when the pattern's only looping around 4 bars, 75% makes no difference. The snare will fire off in every one of the 4 repeats. But over 16 bars, this region is 16 bars, the 1 bar pattern repeated 16 times, 75% gives us something different. It gives us, over each bar, it's going to be off, on, off. On, off. On, off, on, off. Yeah, you know what I mean? So if you can work out what the rule is, you're a better man than me. You know? You really are. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter what the damn rule is. you adjust the percentage chance and you can actually see in the region where it will and where that step will and won't trigger. Right? But I know one thing, it is dependent on the length of the region, how many times your pattern is going to cycle round over the region length. That changes what a percentage chance of a particular drum. It changes its chances of triggering in any given bar. The length of the overall amount of repeats of the region changes it as well. I've not checked it, but to be honest, it might also be dependent on the type of drum. Maybe a snare drum, which is a major downbeat drum, that's a critical timekeeping drum, might have a different set of rules, I don't know, to a tom. I mean, look, if I set this at 50%, and then this tom, let's put a tom on the same step, and give that the same 50% chance. Well, is there going to be a difference? Let's see. They're both at 50%. Well, good God, there's a massive difference. Look at it. The tom is only going to play in bar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, and 16. It ain't going to play in the first 4 bars. It's not going to play in bar 7. It's not going to play in bar 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, or 15. But the snare is going to play in, it's not going to play in bar 1, 2, or 3. It's going to play in 4, not in 5, then it's going to play in 6, 7, not in 8, not in 9, and then it's going to play in 10, 11, 12, 13, not in 14, not in 15, and then in 16. So, yeah, my suspicion was correct. Depending on the type of drum. Oh, wait, but it also might be how many times that drum plays in the pattern. So, just to be fair, let's put another tom there on the same step. It's a percussion tom type sound, right? But it's on a tom lane. This is the MIDI note for the small tom, right? In general MIDI drum map terms. Right. And yeah, it has changed the percentage chance of the first tom triggering. It has. Now the first tom is going to trigger in bar 1, not in 2, in 3, not in 4, in 5, 6, 7 and 8, 9, 10, not in 11, not in 12, not in 13, but in 14, 15 and 16. So yeah, it's dependent on what type of drum it is, and it's dependent on how many steps are active in the pattern being repeated for the individual drum, and it may well also be dependent on what type of drum it is, you know. But anyway, look, I'm babbling on, but the point is, what the rules are, God only knows, but you can see where a note or a drum is going to trigger in the repeated patterns of the region by looking at the region. But trying to work it out by listening, mate, you'll just go mad. Trust me, you will. It's just impossible, mate. Alrighty, now look, I'm showing, we'll probably use mostly this in drums. You ain't going to use it on a main downbeat like snare. You're going to want that to fire off every single time. But it's those little offbeat snares. You know what I'm saying? Like, take those out. Let me function clear for all rows chance. No, actually, let's clear all those offsets as well. Clear for all rows, the start offset. Alright. Yeah, you're not going to use percentage chance on the main boom, boom downbeats of the snare. But you know when you got one of those sort of like funky little drum things? Speed it up a bit. That kind of thing. And then we'll just reduce those down in velocity a bit. Yeah, these little offbeat type licks, yeah, then you can give them percentage chance, and they're not going to fire off every time. You know what I mean? It's just, as the same drum pattern loops around and around and around, takes away that, well, it's a pattern looping round and round. It just puts a little bit of variety in there, right? Anyway, you got all that, right? That's chance. I suppose you use this mostly in drums, but thinking about it, you could have a melodic pattern and you've got your key notes of the melody in. Then you add in some sort of secondary transition notes that just bridge the gap between the main notes of the melody. And I suppose you could give those a percentage chance, so that as that melody loop or hook loops round and round and round, sometimes those little transition notes between the main notes of your hook or melody will trigger, and sometimes they won't with each repeat. You could maybe use it like that as well, right? Well, that's chance. We looked at start offset, the start of a note, starting it up to 50% late or up to 50% early. The note will always be the length of the step. So now it's starting in the middle of that step, but it's going to always be the length of the step, the note, a 16th. So it starts in the middle of the step, ends in the middle of the next step. Or that way, it ends in the middle of the step, so it starts in the middle of the previous step. And you use that for offsetting timing, either slightly ahead or slightly behind, whatever you want, right? Okay. We looked at that. But there's two left to look at, step rate and skip. Now, that step rate, well, we're in a default 1 bar long pattern, and the step value, or step rate, is at its default of a 16th. Every step on every row is a 16th in length. But you can actually make a step any step rate you want. So I could make this kick drum step, come on, an 8th. Now that makes the note being generated on that step also an 8th in length. Look, there it is, right? But there are still 16 steps in the kick row. But now the first step is a value of 2/16. So this kick step, playing an 8th length note, is now an 8th in length. Which means that when the pattern plays, all of the steps on all of the lanes are going to play a 16th and then move to the next 16th, but this is going to be playing an 8th on that step. So as the pattern moves forward off that step, the kick will be a 16th late to the rest of the pattern. Because this is now an 8th. It takes an 8th for that step to finish, whereas all the other steps and all the other rows are just taking a 16th to finish, then they move on to the next step. Yeah, okay, if you change the step value of a step and you put it to step on, so a note's being generated on that step, it will be the length of the step value you've put in. So in theory, you could use this in a melodic pattern to put an 8th note on that step. But as soon as you do that, this row will be a 16th late for the rest of the pattern. And as it loops round over subsequent loops, if your region is dragged out longer than the length of the pattern, every time it loops round, this lane with that 8th note on that step, that 8th value note on that step, will become a 16th later and later and later with each time the pattern plays round. Look. Because every time the pattern cycles round again, it's playing an 8th on that step, making it a 16th later every time the pattern cycles round. So, I'm not sure when you'd use that. I'm not sure. If I wanted an 8th note to play here, well, I'd just tie 2 steps together. Now I've got an 8th length note, but covering 2/16. So it'll play an 8th note here, but it'll stay in sync with the rest of this row will stay in sync with the rest of the pattern. So anyway, that is step rate. You can change the value of any step to any rate you want. And finally, skip. Well, skip is that feature I used at the very, very start of the very first video in this step sequencer series of videos. And again, the link to the playlist of all these step sequencer tutorial videos is in the description below. I started off with this drum pattern. And it's a simple 1-bar drum pattern. Really simple. Okay. Right. But all I did was go to choose the value skip and just skip the last 16th on the kick row. That means that the pattern plays along. When all of the rows are playing that final step, the kick row doesn't play that step. The kick row now only has 15 steps. So on that step, when every other row is playing that step, the kick is starting here, playing from the start of its row again. So it gets a 16th ahead. Then the next time it loops around, it skips that step and begins playing again, a 16th early. So as the pattern, this 1-bar pattern, loops around and around and around this 16-bar length region, it's the same pattern repeating 16 times, the kick will get a 16th ahead, 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 every time it loops around. Right? And that has the effect of, it's like the drummer saying, well, look, man, I'm going to play the hi-hat and the snare, keep the rhythm, keep the groove, so to speak, but I'm going to get really creative with the kick drum, man. I'm going to play a kick drum variation on every single bar of this 16 bars. And to achieve that, all you've got to do is put a skip in on that step here. And what you'll see is, as the pattern plays round and round and round and round and round, the kick gets a 16th further and further and further and further ahead until it starts coming around and comes up to start to lap all the other lanes in the pattern. Right, here we go. And eventually in the final bar, that it catches up and they're back in sync. And then it cycles to the start of the region and it happens all over again. It's just brilliant. Because with just one simple click to put in a skip step, I can make the drummer vary the kick across all 16 bars. Now you can't do that with the drummer editor. You know, the drummer pattern editor. And yeah, you could do it in a traditional MIDI pattern by copying and pasting the pattern, then shifting the kick every time and copying and pasting again, but it would take ages. It's absolutely brilliant. Well, I'll tell you what, let's try it with the hi-hat. If we skip the last step on the hi-hat, but only the closed hat, that is going to, this hi-hat pattern will become a 16th ahead for every cycle of the pattern as it plays across that region. But the open hat will always play on the 3rd 16th of every bar. But because the closed hat pattern is starting earlier and earlier, a 16th earlier each time the pattern cycles around, in some bars this 16th after the open hat will be empty, and the open hat will be able to play a longer but sometimes this 16th step will be filled with a closed hat, and the closed hat shuts the open hat down, so then the open hat will just play a short and get closed down by the closed hat here. So this open hat will always play in that position, but it's going to sometimes play a long slice and sometimes a more choked slice. And this pattern will constantly vary as the pattern just cycles around, while the kick and snare and the open hat keep time always in the same place, like this. Etc. I'm telling you, mate, it's just such a great feature. This, it really is. I'm not really giving it a lot of thought as to how I'd use it in a melodic pattern. Not really sure. But there may, you know, if I give it some thought, I might think of creative ways I could use it. But certainly for drums, you just make a basic 1 bar pattern, put the skip on the end of one drums row, and then loop, you know, drag the region out so that pattern is playing round and round and round and round over multiple bars, over a section of your song. And whichever drum has the skip in, it will start to play creatively, almost like it's playing freeform. But you'll find that because the kick originally works with the basic pattern, as it cycles round, it'll always seem to work with the rest of the pattern, even if it's in some repeats more wacky than others. It'll tend to work empathically with the rest of the drums that are holding down the main beat. It's just brilliant. That's just one feature that you can do with it, right? Right, and that skip, and that's all your values, right? Oh mate, I'm telling you, this thing, there's so many facets to this step sequencer, and if you're going to show what they do so that people who are beginners to Logic, or maybe even beginners to using a DAW, can understand it, that's what I'm doing here, right? A bit of coffee. Okay, that's the values. Right, next, where are we? Next, I'm going to show you controllers. We haven't looked at controllers yet, right? But let's go with this. Didn't we have a pattern on the piano somewhere? Oh, maybe not. Let me just put an empty pattern here. Not MIDI. Create pattern region. Yeah, any row can be made into an automation lane for any type of automation. You can automate anything. Standard MIDI controllers. You can automate the instrument parameters on the track, or the parameters for any of the insert effects, or anything on the main channel, the sends, pan, volume fader, etc. Anything. It's exactly the same as track automation, but for the step sequencer pattern. So we're going to look at that next. I'm going to show you an example of that in action, and then for the final video I'm going to show you these techniques where we use the step sequencer in combination with Drum Machine Designer, and we exploit a feature of the new Drum Machine Designer, and then by exploiting that feature we can use features of the step sequencer to do some really cool but very important things with our drum patterns. Okay, so next I'm going to just show you some stuff about controllers. Alright, see you for the next one.